Molly Baddies, and I work with Dann Vazquez Associates, who've been facilitating the public forums that have been a part of the Sustainable Northampton planning process. I want to welcome all of you tonight and thank you all for coming. We're going to make this as brief and as informal as possible. Primarily, this is an opportunity for us to check with you to make sure that the kinds of summary that we have coming out of the opinions expressed at the community forums, neighborhood forums, and focus groups do actually represent what you think you heard. Make sure that if we've missed anything, you speak up about that, or if you think that there's anything that needs greater emphasis, that you have a chance to say that. The Sustainable Northampton process started almost exactly a year ago with a meeting of all the boards in the city, and then with a kickoff event in the fall with the American Institute of Architects team that led a couple of charrette days to focus on what could a sustainable Northampton look like. There's a steering committee of about 25 or 30 people who have been working very hard on this over the past year. The focus groups that we held were at 4 neighborhood schools, the elementary schools at Jackson Street, Ryan Road, Bridge Street, and in Leeds. And then there were 5 focus groups where we met specifically with the youth at high school, here at the high school, with Council on Aging folks and their community, with the junior high at JFK, with the business community at a chamber-sponsored meeting at the Hotel Northampton, with a group of folks who were really interested in the arts at the Center for the Arts, and with folks representing Casa Latina and residents of the Housing Authority. So we've really made an effort, the city's made an effort to try and reach out to as many different diverse sectors of the community. In addition, we had the opinions that 3,000 people expressed on the survey that went out with the census. Really great response to that. And there were, I think we totaled about 500 people who attended one or more of the focus groups. So we've had a great deal of input, and this is a chance to sort of midway through this process to give a summary of what we think we've heard. The intention of the whole process was to get a pulse of the community, to find out what your perceptions are of where Northampton is, what you really value, what your concerns are, what you think the city needs to be grappling with, and ways in which you think the city could take action to resolve some of the issues or to maintain those valued aspects of Northampton as they prepare the comprehensive plan. The agenda for tonight is basically pretty straightforward. We're going to focus on each of the 4 questions that were addressed at these forums, at these neighborhood meetings, one at a time, and present briefly the summary, which you have in hand. There is additional information, and if you want more data, we've got it. It's on the Northampton website. You just go to www.northamptonma.gov and follow the links to Sustainable Northampton, and you can get more information than you even have in your hands tonight. We're trying not to overwhelm you with data, but to give you as much supporting documentation, and that's the other part of our agenda. After each summary of what we heard in the responses to the 4 questions, members of the, Wayne Feiden from the Planning Department and Terry Emerson from the Mayor's Department, and we'll get the Mayor up here too, to share some of the data that they've been collecting that support or complement the themes that evolved from the forums that we held. Are there any questions at this point? I think it's fairly straightforward, but please feel free to raise your hand at any point when you have a question, and we want to give you a chance at each of the 4 questions to respond if you think that there's something we're missing or that you want to add to. The first question that we dealt with, and it's in your summary, is given that change is an ongoing aspect of a vibrant community, what characteristics and community values should guide Northampton as it plans for the future? It's probably not a surprise that what people really valued in Northampton was this mix of a vibrant, active downtown surrounded by a lot of open space and natural resources that have been increasingly protected, but also with these identifiable neighborhood pockets throughout the city that have their own distinct character. The vision for the future, what people wanted to see was additional transportation options that would rely less on the car, more on alternative modes of transportation that would link the city in this way. I think we've covered all of that. I think part of the vibrancy of the city is has to do with quality arts and cultural, historical, and educational resources and social services, as well as a diverse business space in the community. So with that, I want to introduce Wayne and have him cite some statistics that support this.
Thank you. So in your handout, there's a whole section on data. One of the points we want to make to you is, as the planning process goes forward, we're really trying to have a plan guided by two things. One is, what does the community want? And that's where we've heard a lot of focus groups, and that's from the survey, that's from the comments you give us tonight. And the other is sort of get some truthing from the data that's out there. So one of our jobs this evening is just give you quick samples, quick, snippets of the data that we've collected, Pioneer Valley Planning Commission has collected for us, the Donahue Institute has connected for us, just so you can see the sort of things we're doing to sort of check ourselves to make sure that people's perceptions are grounded in reality. So I'm just going to do a couple data points. First one is on page 1 of the data if you want to follow this. There's two tables at the top of the page. One thing that's interesting is we've heard consistently in people's answer to this first theme, this first question, was there's a real sense that Northampton is changing dramatically. And what's interesting from the table is, and probably most of you know this, Northampton's population hasn't changed in 40 years and 50 years. So you see population numbers are pretty flat. But what we've had is, we've had the state hospital close, we've had the VA hospital become a small fraction of what it used to be, and we have family size continues to drop. So we have to have a lot more housing units to house the same number of people. And that's really what drives the perception of a lot of housing out there. But probably even more than the number of housing units is where they're located spatially. 33 units were built in Northampton State Hospital in the last couple of years, and most people weren't even aware of that. The hospital can absorb lots of units, it's not really visible to the community. 33 units are built on a subdivision that usually consumes 50 acres of land, and we hear from 100 abutters nearby. And so I think a lot of perception comes from the land use patterns, and hopefully the data here supports it. Likewise, you see a table on open space. There's often a question of, does Northampton have enough open space? And there's one of the things you can look at in different ways. The city's been buying about 100 acres of land of open space per year for the last 15 years. About 15% of the city's land mass is permanently preserved open space. So from that standpoint, it's a huge number. If you look at the Commonwealth as a whole, or Hampshire County as a whole, we have less open space than those areas have. What's not on here, of course, if you look at cities of 30,000, we probably have a lot more open space, because both Hampshire County and the Commonwealth figures include state forests and state parks and things which change the numbers. Other data points on page 5, the table in the middle is transportation indicators. There's a lot of discussion there in a lot of the public forums and in the survey about a real interest in alternative transportation, helping people walk to work, helping people bicycle to work, helping people walk and bicycle to other destinations. And again, this table, you can look at it one of two ways. You can say, we're doing an incredibly good job because compared to the Commonwealth, we have a much higher proportion of our population that walks to work. And that's true. The other way to look at it is, we're still talking about only 14% of our population walks to work. By the time you include bicycle and transit, the majority of us go to work in cars. And so sometimes we hear people who want a lot more bicycles and pedestrians going to work, but also we hear from the majority of people that most of the trips are by car to accommodate those as well.
Right. We'll get the question after Terry.
Okay.
We're going to go through all the data stuff first and then open it up for comments. I just wanted to address the concept of a vibrant downtown and tourism. And I'm on page 2 of the data handout at the bottom. And you'll notice that we have a significant part of the population in the city that lives within walking distance of downtown, which we think contributes significantly to the downtown vibrancy. So 25% of the city's population lives within 10 or 15 minutes walking distance, and 40% of the population lives within 20 minutes walking distance. I also wanted to point out on page 6, one common theme that we've heard throughout all of the meetings was people appreciate Northampton's diversity. And on page 6, you'll see the racial breakdown of our population, and 90% of the population is white. And then 5% Hispanic Latino, 2% Black population, 3% Asian. So from a racial perspective, we're actually not diverse at all. I think our diversity really comes from economic, lifestyle, political viewpoint, cultural diversity. I think that's it for this one.
Am I supposed to do something here?
Not so great.
Did you want to add something, Joel?
Well, I just wanted to observe something about what Wayne was talking about. Talked about walking and bicycling, and we have pathetic figures on mass transit. And I think, you know, right now it seems like it's not going anywhere, but the gas costs $12 a gallon, and we're going to need those free buses that go back and forth to Florence every 5 minutes. You know, I think we've got to be thinking that way in the long term. That's all.
Great. Thank you.
I actually do have one other data point that I wanted to mention. On page 3 of the data handout, the Chamber has done some analysis of where our visitors come from, and primarily our primary market draw is from the 3 county Pioneer Valley areas, including Northampton and Hampshire County, at 67% of our visitors. 22% of the overall visitors are directly from Northampton. The next market draw area is outside the Pioneer Valley, but in the Northeast, and that includes Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and eastern parts of Massachusetts.
Any other comments on this question or on any of the data that you've heard? Yes.
One of the things that I haven't seen mentioned is the need to have a better service through Amtrak. I think that would cut down on a lot of traffic in the city if people could get used to traveling on Amtrak. And we should encourage Amtrak to come up not only to Northampton but to Greenfield, make a circuit around to Boston, and because those are the Boston is a commercial area, Hartford and the corridor of the valley is very important. And it used to be, of course, the students at Smith would all use the train service and with their luggage and everything else. That used to be quite a scene in the fall. And now it seems as though very few people are using Amtrak, but I think if the service was available, they would really make use of it, and it would be helpful.
Yeah.
Just to give some credence to what you're saying, there's been a lot of discussion about the idea of bringing a north-south rail up further. You may have read in the paper, and Catherine probably knows more about this than me, but there's been discussion right now to bring the north-south rail from New Haven to Springfield. We've been lobbying to bring it up further than Springfield to Northampton and then Greenfield. There's a lot of serious discussion about that. The planning at time and then the completion time for that, the arc of time is pretty broad for that. But there is a lot of discussion about that. There's a lot of serious interest in that. The Connecticut legislature has already appropriated money to look at the Hartford to Springfield piece of that corridor, and then we need to work in Massachusetts on the Springfield North piece.
And you'll see that transportation is a concern and a topic that emerges in each of these questions that we deal with. The second question that we focused on, and we
Got it? You want to hear?
it's doing a little warpy tonight. We phrased it somewhat differently with each group, depending on what the constituency was, but essentially we wanted to know what changes have occurred in Northampton during the time you lived here or worked here, or both, that have most affected you. And we wanted people to speak both to the positive changes that they've seen as well as the more easily recognizable sometimes negative changes that they've perceived. People felt that Northampton is increasingly a hub, a regional hub, that there's a lot of focus. A lot of people are coming to Northampton for all sorts of events and venues, that it's really, that's contributed a lot to the vibrancy of the city. It's brought in tourism dollars. The other positive change that people commented on quite a bit was the attention to conservation. Although Wayne says that maybe Northampton figures the percentage-wise lower in terms of amount of open space that it has, that it owns. There's increasing attention to that, 100 acres per year that's been saved, and people are appreciative of that, although, of course, everybody says there should be more. There needs to be more attention to that. Not directly related, but influenced certainly by the attractiveness of Northampton, has been an increase in development, especially development pressure in outlying areas. There's a tremendous increase in traffic that people talked about a great deal, and parking pressures in the downtown area. There's been a dramatic increase in housing costs and also in taxes that people are concerned about, pricing out more middle-income families and poorer families out of the city, with a diminishment, therefore, in diversity. And an increase in rental costs for businesses, for artists. All of those were major changes that people were concerned about. At the same time, there's a decrease in the amount of state and federal aid that's coming in, specifically educational resources and funding for city services. So this funnel sort of shows that shrinking of the funding that's coming into the city, that therefore contributes to the increase in what the tax burden has to be to support the services that people want.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Was there any analysis about agricultural production either increasing or decreasing in the same number of years that we were looking at these changes?
Not in terms of value, in terms of acreage and loss of acreage, we figures in that, and not in terms of dollar value. In terms of conflict, one thing that we're going to focus on is transportation. You know, I attend 200 public hearings a year, and I would say the number one issue we get at every public hearing of all kinds is traffic issues. So I talked before about interest in bicycles, interest in pedestrian access, and Joel's comment about public transit. But you know, on page 5 of the data, you see the astronomical increase in vehicle miles and in cars. The mayor wanted me to bring a cartoon, the Pogo cartoon, "We've met the enemy, and here's us." In the time period from 1890 to 2005, we've had a 26% increase in cars registered in Northampton. This is the same time period where downtown has been booming, where we have more people than ever living within a walking distance of downtown. And walking downtown, we have the first rail trail in New England. We have, you know, the first state rail trail in Western Mass. There's lots of things that help people walk and bicycle to work, and yet 26% more cars than before. The same page down a little bit. From 2000 to 2004, a 20% increase, almost a 50% increase in vehicle miles traveled. Pioneer Valley Planning Commission modeling out 2010 is seeing that trend is going to continue to be expected at an equally large rate. This is done, the increase is partially because of growth in hill towns. As you all know, many of the hill towns have double-digit growth in terms of new housing starts, and many of those people are living in hill towns and driving through Northampton, so we have limited control over that. But even though the hill towns are growing wildly and we're not, we're still bigger than most of the hill towns combined. So an awful lot of the traffic is Northampton generated. The other figure in here is on the next page, page 2. Remember residential building permits? This goes back to the point of, we all know that Northampton's growing wildly and we see incredible growth pressures all over us. And then we look at the building permits, and that's not really borne out. When you look at the number of building permits being issued in Northampton, we have pretty steady growth. We had a spurt in 2004 to 63, but 33 of those 63 were at the state hospital in one single project. These are the number of single new housing units. We didn't correct for population if we need to, but if you look at the table, compare our building starts to Belchertown. Belchertown has a smaller population, yet almost twice as many building permits. Amherst, excluding UMass students, has a smaller population and a per 1,000 population, their permits are probably pretty similar to ours. So again, I think it's perception of where building's going on and how the building is turned, and not so much the amount of units. This chart is just about residential, but if you did commercial, the numbers would be even more depressing depending on how you look at it. But we have not given that much permits for new commercial development.
There's a question.
Do you have any data on ridership on public transportation at the same period as
We didn't include this. It's interesting. I just noted the last 2 years. 2 years ago, ridership plummeted. Now is the year that PVTA increased their fares. In the last year, ridership has gone up dramatically, and obviously that's partially related to
We can
fuel
add
prices.
that to the data that we put in front of
I mean, I realize that's outside the city's control to some extent, but it could be a huge factor.
The other figures that PVPC has collected, which we can get from them, is who rides the bus, and not surprisingly, the free bus to UMass has people who have choice. So it is people who have cars, who have other means of getting there. The free bus, it's easy, it's often better than riding in staying in the peripheral lots. For the most part, the vast majority of people riding the buses are people who don't have choices. People who don't have cars, people who can't drive, and they're not really desirable routes for people who have choices. And so that's always an issue for us is, even if there was money to increase transit, many of us say we really should have more in transit, but we don't necessarily follow through and actually but we can actually have some of that.
I just want to clarify the bus is not free.
What's that?
Not for,
No, students rent free because they pay a fee, but everybody else pays no.
It used to, I mean, that's another change. It used to be free, and it isn't.
This ridership's actually going up, so.
Well, it's been many years since
it's,
it's been free.
and the ridership is really going up on the express bus. I don't think it's going up as
Right.
dramatically on the local.
That's right.
Well, no, they both have. They
As
were
much,
both up.
as much on the M43 as the M40?
I don't remember the
I
stats,
thought
but they were
it was-
both up in the last couple
Oh,
of years.
okay, good.
And even the express bus is somewhat deceiving because there's now a lot less service. So each
Right.
bus has more passengers, but there's fewer buses than we had 2 years ago.
Right, gotcha.
In terms of what you were saying about the hill towns, a concern that I've had is that the bus to Williamsburg has no bike rack.
We're working on it.
You're working on that, great. Thank you.
Martha?
Yeah, there was something you said about the other, I forgot what it was, the phrase you used, but some bus routes are desirable, other bus routes are not desirable. What is that? What do you
Well,
mean
you know,
by that?
if you take the bus from Florence Heights to downtown,
Right.
it's a long ride.
45 minutes.
Yeah. And so it's not really attractive for people who have a car. And so for the most part, people taking that bus are people who, for some reason or other, aren't comfortable or can't afford to drive.
Right, so, but was the implication of that there's nothing that we can do to improve that service? Because there are people who need that service. I mean, that's one of the things that we heard, is that people need better and more frequent.
I think some of this more in land use later, but I'll give you a quick jumping ahead. One of the questions we asked, when we did the survey questions, we knew, quite frankly, if we said, should we have more transit? Everyone's going to say, yeah, it's great, let's have more transit. You know, we know, Leslie can tell, that the fare box covers a third of the bus. So the fare box covers a third, so you have to subsidize the other 2/3, and that money isn't there. So one of the things we asked is, we didn't ask, do you want more transit? Because frankly, I know the answer is going to be yes, or not afford. One of the things we asked is, do you want development at densities necessary to support transit? At high densities? And we actually found that an overwhelming majority of people either agreed or strongly disagreed with that statement. So I'll talk about more at land use of where people want development to occur. But that may be the better opportunity to improve transit.
So again, back to downtown vibrancy and also arts and culture, which is a big piece of that downtown vibrancy. On page 3 of the data handout, the Arts Council, we think that the number, the volume, and the quality of the arts and entertainment that is offered in Northampton contributes to downtown vibrancy. And we offer at least 500 events, arts and cultural events a year, and another 200 recreational events a year, which is pretty good for a community our size. And then also on page 4, you'll notice that Northampton, both on the public side and also on the private nonprofit cultural organization side, has significant more spending than communities in the rest of the Pioneer Valley. The city spends $51 per capita on cultural and recreation compared to 48 in the Pioneer Valley. And our nonprofit arts organizations have assets of $864 per capita compared to $97 per capita and on average throughout the rest of the valley. Another piece of analyzing our vibrancy, in terms of page 12, is the retail trends, particularly downtown. And one of the things that was pretty startling to us is that Northampton's market share, retail market share, is declining between 97 and 2002. You'll see in the second to the bottom table that we capture, our change has, our retail sales are increasing by 15%, Amherst 62%, Hampshire County 31%, all over. The change in percent, we were decreasing 5%, Amherst increasing. We didn't have those numbers for the whole Hampshire County. You also look at what our market share is in the Pioneer Valley. We're at 6.5% compared to West Springfield at 14 and 19%, and Holyoke, which actually was a little lower than I expected at 10 or 11%. The information on Hadley is suppressed because there are not enough retail establishments for the Census Bureau to release that information. They're worried about confidentiality. We think that might change in the next census because they have more and more stores, which might put them above the threshold. But backing into the numbers, you can see that Hampshire County, the rest of Hampshire County, if you look at Northampton's market share and Amherst's market share, that leaves the rest of the county at around 54%. I think I said 60% last night. My math was off. But there are going to be pockets of retail around the county that come out of that 54%, but they're fairly small. East Hampton, Belchertown. But I think the majority of that is probably going to be Hadley sales. So they're capturing the larger chunk as a retail opportunity in Hampshire County. One other item is on the second table, our largest growth in retail sales has been in non-store retail, which is catalog and internet sales. And what we haven't been able to determine is what portion of that 111% increase is actually Northampton-based internet or catalog sales. I suspect it's a fairly small piece of that.
The interesting part of that is that for the county as a whole, that number was a 14% increase. So Northampton is 111 compared to a county increase of 14.
So that's Northampton businesses that are selling?
No, those are just the actual internet sales. We're not sure who's actually making those sales, which businesses are making those sales.
So it's businesses within that area?
No, it's the sales that they can come from anywhere.
It's
So
purchases.
It's buying from outside?
Yeah.
Are you saying it's purchases, not sales?
Yeah.
You're saying people in Northampton are buying that much,
Yes.
but we don't know where they're buying it from, and chances are it's
It's
not
not
from
here.
Northampton because they wouldn't be doing it on the internet.
Well, actually, I do know that there are some downtown businesses like Scare Gallery that do have internet sales from outside of the state.
Do we
But-
measure that?
Some of our follow-up data with the Donnie Commission is to see if we can break it out. We don't have that data right now.
Yeah.
And part of the reason to do these forums is that for you to say was, hey, what about this piece or that piece of data? So this is helpful for us to then go back and ask. So my job is to talk for a minute about the funnel. So if you go to page 14 at the bottom of the page, you'll see a chart that says state aid as a percentage of the city's general fund budget. And this goes back to 1993 when the state ed reform law was passed, and you'll see that we went up. We went from 27 up to a high point of 30% of the city's budget being supported by state revenues, and we're now back down to 25%. So the cuts that happened in 2002 really dramatically dropped our state aid share. And if you did a chart back to 1981 when Proposition 2.5 passed, you would see the same thing 2 more times. So every time there's a boom cycle on the state level, our state aid has gone up. Every time there's a bust cycle, we've gone down more than our state, a percentage drop that's deeper than the state income drop was. And then we go up slower than the state recovery. And
That's because of our lack of clout. Or what is it?
no, this is all formula driven. This is not, I wish there were some backroom with the cigars, because if there were, we would have done a little bit better. Stan and Bill were saying that chair of Ways and Means, and the majority were there at one point, but it didn't.
Where is this formula?
These formulas are devised by the legislature, and they have to do with property values, per capita income, very, very, very straightforward measures.
The education formula.
And the education formula has to do with property values and per capita income. It's all very straightforward. And this is the way it plays out for us. And part of our dilemma is that we have higher than average property values and lower than average income. And the emphasis on most of the formula is more weighed heavily on property values and weighed less heavily on income. So that's going to be a struggle that we've been working on now for a couple of years, trying to change that mix. Just as an aside, the table's not in here, but there was a study done by the Brookings Institute about federal support to municipalities. There was a study done that looked at the 100 top U.S. cities from 1977 to, I think it was 2004. In 1977, the federal government supported about 17% of their general fund, of their budgets. In 2004, it was down to 5%. So the state picture coupled with a federal picture gives you an understanding of the shift back to local dollars. A higher percentage of local dollars back to the state.
We don't have the funnel of all the money sucked out of Northampton to go to the federal government.
No, we don't. There's no reverse on that back.
We didn't have a paper big enough in that time frame.
The third question was a particularly interesting one and gave us, I think, a very broad range of responses. It had to do with where do people perceive potential conflicts between the goals that we have for a sustainable Northampton, or between the goals that we say we have and how we act, is another way of wording this. And there are on your sheet a number of different categories that this diagram represents. I think in sort of the big picture idea, this conflict between residents' desires for services and yet a reluctance to pay higher taxes to support those services is certainly one area of conflict. The difference between what we say we want as a sustainable community in terms of smart growth, but also the realities of private property ownership as it's structured here is another potential conflict. I'm not going to go through every one of these because you have information, you can read it, and you can get supplementary information on the web, but to cite one or two for each of these categories. In terms of land use, the stated desire for putting greater density where density already exists, for infill, for using abandoned lots or buildings, to reuse existing structures, is somewhat in conflict with the majority opinion of people who would rather have a single-family house in an outlying area with more green around them. This may be a trend that's changing as people, especially as people have been pointing out, as we don't want to rely on gasoline-powered cars, but to live in urban areas. But there is this basic conflict between what we say we want and how we actually are acting. The desire to have more businesses and jobs and diverse housing options at a range of affordability versus a desire to keep open space and wildlife habitat. To find ways, it's not that these are essentially always in conflict, but how do we resolve these areas of conflict? In terms of equity issues, we've talked about the desire for having a diverse community, but is Northampton, number one, really that diverse? And the way in which it's growing, is that decreasing, in fact, our diversity because it's decreasing our affordability? We see ourselves as being a progressive and welcoming community. That was one of the summary points on what people really value that I forgot to mention, and I think it's because it's hard to illustrate, but people really love the fact that Northampton is seen as a welcoming, diverse community, and yet we have to acknowledge that there are class conflicts and racial tensions and concerns in the community that we have to face and we need to deal with. In terms of transportation, there is this desire to promote bicycles and bicycle routes to get away from the vehicle, but how many of us really do give up our car when we're under pressure, time pressure, all sorts of justifications, but it's hard for us to actually get back to riding bikes the way we did when we were kids. Age might have a factor too. There's also, I'm going to word this a little differently than how it is phrased here, but a desire for more parking downtown is, are we inviting more cars into the place where we say there are too many cars already? So we're talking about wanting to have public transportation to reduce the reliance on cars, but at the same time we're saying we need more parking spaces so that we can accommodate more cars. In terms of economic development, pick a couple of those. People have said we want to get rid of the empty spaces along King Street, for example. We want to have more commercial development. But how should that commercial development take place? What's it going to look like? But that's an area of some controversy and great discussion, and the resolution of that is yet to be. People want to have a broad range of products, of retail stores here, be able to choose among. And yet we really want to support locally owned businesses, and can we afford to keep them there? Can we afford not to? I mean, those are some of the issues that we're really dealing with in terms of economic development. It's perceived, we perceive Northampton as a vibrant, lively, affluent community, and yet are there enough good paying jobs to really keep people here? Can people afford to live in Northampton, to work in Northampton? Much was said about energy, although there's only one statement of conflict here, but it shows up in a lot of different ways. But in terms of, for example, wanting to rely less and less on gasoline-powered vehicles. But there's a perception that there's little in the way of tangible plans to make a reliance on petrochemicals less essential. And in the middle of all of this, and this was a graphic dilemma that ends up making a point, that the municipal resources are really stretched and curtailed here. I just ran out of space, but it really does make its point that increasingly the city is having trouble trying to meet all of the various goals that we're saying, and we're establishing more and more goals with limited financial backing. So all of those are areas, are topical areas. There's another way of looking at how we organize these conflicts. One is choices we have to make in terms of habit or lifestyle. I've mentioned a couple of those as we've gone through it. There are goals themselves that could be seen to be in conflict or potentially in conflict that need to be resolved. There are regulatory issues and constraints that keep us from being able to achieve all that we want to achieve at this point without making some changes in the regulatory climate. There are implementation costs, the whole question about how are we going to finance some of these changes. And then there are issues that are beyond the city's control. It doesn't mean that the city is not in a position to influence those, but things like regional transportation are beyond the ability of the city itself to resolve. So I think with that, I'll turn it over to Wayne.
Thanks. We know some of the conflicts in both the land use area and the equity area. Most of them talk about office survey. This is the legal size paper we passed out. We sent the survey out with the city census. Statistically, about 30% of you return them. So we have returns from about 30% of Northampton households, which was frankly a much higher return rate than we thought. Some of the questions weren't as well worded as they could have been, but a lot of the questions, there's sort of multiple attempts to get at the same thing. So we think even though some of the questions probably need to discount, we sort of have a good sense of what people want. So I'm going to talk about some of the results we got and try to compare that with other data that we have. But in the land use area, a few points. This is the page that's marked environment and land use. 85% of Northampton residents accept the premise that we need some amount of regulation, that people shouldn't be able to build wherever they want to build. 70% of the respondents said that we should be building more homes at the state hospital. It's a good place for development, because only it's close to downtown, those kinds of things. 90% of the respondents want us to do more about preserving open space and wildlife corridors and those kinds of things. 89%, this is the figure I mentioned before, think that we should be encouraging development at densities that can support transit. So all those things sort of support Molly's graphic here of preserving outlying areas and doing development in urban core areas. So that's great. The survey doesn't show a lot of conflict. The conflict comes from our experience when we actually get projects. That people think that's where they want development, but people don't necessarily really want the project across the street. And the vacant lot across the street then suddenly becomes valuable open space when it's being proposed for development. And when we talk about zoning that might allow more development, there's always a reason for those areas not to be zoned. So those are conflicts we need to think about as we go forward in the process. A lot of discussion over the next few months is hopefully how do we resolve those conflicts. The other area of conflict has to do with affordable housing. Again, from the survey, it seemed like the results were clear. 79% of the population think that we don't have enough housing that's affordable to all of our residents. So that's affordable to low-income residents and moderate-income residents and presumably upper-level residents. Well, there's not enough housing to meet all that affordability gap. 69% of the respondents think that we don't have enough small housing units. This is the jargon is market rate affordable. The idea that small units may be affordable without subsidies. People don't think we have enough of those units. 82% think we don't have enough housing for people earning, or for units selling between 150,000 to 250,000. This is the jargon is workforce housing. This isn't necessarily really low-end housing, but it's housing for people who work for a living in Northampton, who earn our median income. So there seems to be some consensus there. In terms of the data points, it seems to support that we have some real shortage of housing. Only 21% of Northampton's population can afford to buy a median-priced house in Northampton. So there's some lower-level homes that people can afford. If you look at the average, the median price based on sales, so assuming that sales are a good reflection on what houses actually are worth, only 21% of housing is affordable to people earning median income.
That's on page 7. Right?
Page 7, yeah, I'm sorry.
That didn't come from the,
No,
that's
that's-
the survey.
No, it wasn't consensus. That's from data planning commission collected from other sources. And so, depending on you look at it, this is horrible news. That's a very low number. If you compare it to the Commonwealth as a whole, we're doing better. The figure for the Commonwealth is only 17.4% of our residents can afford it. If you look at the greater Boston area, I don't know the number, but I'm sure it's 10% or 12%. So compared to Boston, we're doing great. Compared to the Commonwealth, we're doing sort of about the same as the Commonwealth. But regardless, the number, there's a real shortage here. Nonetheless, again, this issue always comes up when it comes down to how are we going to pay for this sort of affordable housing? Are people willing for regulation to mandate to develop and provide affordable housing? So again, there's a conflict there in terms of actually addressing these issues.
I wanted to point out some facts about the economic development conflicts. If you look at the survey responses, the second page lists the economic development questions. And actually, the responses that we received through the survey and also comments at all of the focus groups and the neighborhood meetings are fairly consistent in terms of the desire for more businesses, more jobs, better wages, a desire to keep businesses in the city, particularly arts and cultural organizations. 84% of the respondents said not enough jobs. 89% think there's not lack of livable wages. 54% agree that we need more businesses. 64% see a loss of arts and arts organizations in the city. 61% agree that there's not enough affordable space in the city for arts organizations. And generally, the there's agreement 62% on the high cost of commercial and industrial space. And then if you look back at the data sheets on page 11, at the top, we did some comparisons of commercial first floor retail rates, rental rates between Northampton and other Pioneer Valley communities. And Northampton is significantly higher than other communities in the valley. Our range of rental rates first floor downtown range from $18 a square foot on the side streets to $30 a square foot or more on Main Street, compared to East Hampton at $48 a square foot, Holyoke at $10 to $12 a square foot, and Greenfield at $7 to $10 a square foot. So Northampton commercial lease rates, first floor retail, is really more comparable to Boston and Eastern Massachusetts rental rates than it is comparable to our Pioneer Valley regional rates, which is a significant reason why we're beginning to lose businesses in the city because they can't afford to be here anymore. On the employment side, 4th table down, we heard a lot about wanting a diverse economic base, and actually Northampton's economic base and our employment sectors is fairly diverse. We have 27% of our job base is in healthcare and social assistance, 15% in education, 13% in retail, 11% in hospitality, accommodation, and food service, and 6% in manufacturing. And the wages that are associated with those sectors, our two highest employment sectors, actually have above average annual wages. Our annual wage in Northampton is about $35,000 a year, lower than the state at $48,000. But those sectors, even though they're service sectors, generally pay higher wages. In terms of retail trade and hospitality, fairly low wages, and also a significant component of our economic base, so that's something that we need to focus on. And manufacturing, although it's a declining sector for us, I think we're starting to see some turnaround there with different kinds of manufacturing, and they actually have the highest wage rates. The other thing to make note of is that it's on the first page, but our median household income in Northampton is $42,000 and has increased, but still in comparison to the state at $50,000, we're lower. And as Wayne mentioned, that we have this affordability gap, and if you look at our wages for the annual wage for a single person, in Northampton, really to be successful, we need to be a 2-wage earner household. In terms of our future growth potential, in comparison to Massachusetts, the Pioneer Valley, and the U.S., Northampton actually does fairly well in terms of attracting healthcare businesses, knowledge creation, education, arts, tourism, and recreation, and advanced technology. And oftentimes people say advanced technology, I don't know any businesses in Northampton that do that. Specifically Morgan, Militech, which makes portable, mostly for the military, but also has very significant commercial application of portable microwave radio communications. What's the other one? Microcow, which makes scientific instrumentation, and Edgel Technology, which makes absorbent materials for food packaging and athletic wear. So we think that those are significant sectors where we can see some growth in the city.
And I get to talk about the money again. So if you turn to page, there's a lot of discussion about equity, especially in terms of education and focusing on spending on education. You turn to page 9. At the bottom of the page, you'll see a chart that goes from FY97 to FY06. Which our state education aid, which is called Chapter 70, as a percentage of our actual net school spending, which is all the money we spend on schools, from 1997 to 2006. And you'll see a precipitous drop again in state support for the schools versus local support for the schools. So the percentage went from about 32% down to about 24.5 or something like that. And I want to put that in the state and federal, state and national context. Statewide, in 2006, the state supported about 38% of the total cost of operating schools in the Commonwealth, and local tax dollars supported by 62%. Nationally, this percentage split is more like 50-50. So that just puts that, we have an over-reliance on the property tax to pay for schools in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Turn to the next page, you'll see the same scary graph that you saw for all aid, replicated for school aid. That's our Chapter 70 school aid, FY 2002, and then back where you saw it. But you have to put that graph next to the next graph, which is below it, which shows that even with those cuts, we've had a steady increase in spending in schools. There was 1 year where we had a small drop. Then we've had a steady increase, which means that we've been substituting local dollars for the lost state dollars. So as the state dollars have left, we've been putting in local tax dollars into the schools, which means they're not available to do other things that they might have done.
Are you totally overwhelmed with statistics? Any comments or questions? Yes.
My children just wanted to share that they go to the Jackson Street School, and the Jackson Street School has a walking school bus and an idling reduction program, and the principal announced today that the buses are no longer going to idle in front of the school. So 2 successes from the perspective of
All right.
Yeah, Jordan.
Yeah, I have a comment. I don't know that it fits into the format of any particular part of this meeting, but it's more of a big picture comment about how we're doing this and how we might think about it. It seems as though it's largely data-driven and public opinion-driven from what we're talking about. And I'm not sure where sustainability fits into that. In other words, I think our aspiration is sustainability. And there are principles and criteria that relate to that they don't necessarily show up in historical data and may not show up in public opinion. Or in public opinion, you get different sides, you get these conflicts. But I don't hear a clear articulation of we're trying to be as sustainable as possible. And I don't know where that comes, but it seems to me that's where we should be heading. Mm-hmm. And if the process doesn't articulate that, then I think we will have failed at it. So
We're not there. We're not at that point yet, I think, is the answer to that.
okay.
But we're going to talk about the rest of the process at the end of this
Okay.
and talk about what the next steps are.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to call Paige.
I'm noticing that there's a lot of data about commercial issues, education. Energy receives a little tiny graph here, or chart. This is a major issue, and it is embedded in each of these areas. If we are not looking at the energy issues in transportation, in tourism, commercial development, in the schools, we're not addressing the issue of sustainability. Energy is embedded in each of these areas, and I don't see it being addressed. Under the area, the criteria about education, I hear about costs of retirement, health insurance benefits, debt service. When the retail, I'm not hearing about how so many of these things that come here and are sold here are coming through the global market and inevitably will bear the cost of their manufacture, the energy manufacture, the transportation costs. If we continue to build a society based on tourism and of retail vibrancy, with looking at these energy issues, we're in deep trouble. We're facing an energy crisis that's enormous. And I'm not seeing that in this process. From October on, very, very little, and it concerns me.
I think it came up quite a bit at each of the meetings.
Yes.
And I think in the next section, you're going to see, in terms of recommendations, that was, again, one of the focal areas, so people had some very specific recommendations, but thank you for raising it.
I'll just also add that I think if you look at the themes handout, you'll notice that energy is probably in every single theme. So it's not that it's overlooked, it's that we don't have a lot of energy data to contribute. This is really, we looked at the ICLEI inventory analysis that was done for the city a couple of years ago and pulled back some of the data out of there. But in terms of the themes and it becoming an issue that needs to be included in the plan, that was very clear. But in terms of data backup, we don't have a lot of information right now to offer.
Okay, and the ICLEI is specifically about emissions. And I guess part of what I'm talking about is supply. And ISO New England has put out numerous warnings that the grid is aging and unable to accommodate. Last fall, they said this winter, if we have a cold snap that lasts for a few days, we don't know what we're going to do. And they just, again, this spring said, this summer, if we have an extended hot spell, we don't, you can expect rolling blackouts.
I think that actually goes hand in glove with what Joel was saying, is what
Yes.
are the sustainability guidelines, what are the goals, the values that we're really trying to incorporate into comprehensive plan for Northampton, and that's kind of, the articulation of those pieces has to come. What we're doing tonight is saying, what did we hear at the public forum? So it is about opinion and perception. And we also wanted to bring some statistical, pieces, some data to complement that as much as we have. But every time somebody says something like that, it means, yes, we've got to get more information and we need to hone these things. So thank you. And you had it.
I did. I really see very little consideration of agriculture in this, and I don't mean just land use. And I mentioned this at the workshops in whenever they were, September or October. I mean, it's part of economic development, and I didn't hear it talked about. It's the answer to some of our transportation issues. It's kind of like energy. It's really a solution for so many things, and we're so lucky to have this as a local resource that could really be nourished and developed to a large degree. It can provide transportation fuels for us. It's not, that's not pie in the sky. That's being done in a lot of places in the country already with biodiesel. I mean, I would like to see much more consideration of what agriculture can do to help solve our problems and to put forward a sustainable, basically an underlying goal towards sustainability.
Just a segue into the next section, which is what can we do?
I didn't know where to say it, so I should have waited.
It's a great segue into the next section.
Okay.
But I also, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that came up, but if we didn't emphasize it enough in the next section, then it's now been mentioned and will be on the list. So.
But I think it's true that in the sessions that I was participating in and facilitating, there wasn't as much discussion about agriculture because there were other themes that came up. And I think that absence in the consciousness or the concerns of the city, the participants, is something to note. And, if it's alarming to you, I'm glad you speak up now to say that that's...
I would just like to see it more in economic development too, especially because it never seems to be considered that way. But I think there's so many ways that it could really help us.
Actually, I don't think it's overlooked. I think one of the things, if you look at it from its current percentage of our agricultural base, it shows up as being less than 1%. I mean, our economic base in terms of employment and number of farms. So right now, it's a fairly small contributor. It doesn't mean that it can't grow and that we shouldn't nurture that. And that shows up in the themes, and I imagine will be considered when we get to the goals piece. But in terms of the data right now, unfortunately, it's not on the radar screen.
Also, I guess that goes back to what you're
Well,
saying.
and
So.
it goes back to, if we just look at where we've been in the era of low energy prices, it's not going to tell us where we should be.
I don't think anybody disagrees with
Yeah.
that. But we're still early in it. Okay. I think somebody else said that.
Yeah, I came in late, so maybe this has already been said, but I think enough of these comments are coming out that we should make clear that the next step in this process is to develop goals. That's not that's not here yet. And the goals are going to be developed not simply on the basis of public opinion and not simply on the basis of, I thought we were going to say this at the beginning, but maybe we
It did get said.
and not simply on the basis of public opinion and not simply on the basis of data about what is and what has been. But precisely taking into account the kind of questions that Joel and Mario and Paige and others have raised about where we want to go. And we want to, I mean, I think partly the purpose of tonight is for us to make sure that we've heard what has been said. But I think that was one of the people who was arguing at the meeting, that it's very important for us to say tonight, this is not the sole basis on which the plan is going to be created and go forward. That we, you know, the whole point of this is a sustainable Northampton initiative, and that means putting stuff into that for whatever combination of reasons didn't come out in the state. So we need to do that, taking this stuff into account, but this is not the sole basis for it. And that's the work that we're doing over the summer, and then in the fall, coming back again with goals before we come up with a plan and say, do these goals and general principles make sense? And then we'll try to develop, you know, a more specific planning document out of that. So this, you know, all of your concerns are precisely where we're going to go next.
Thank you for clarifying that. That's great. There is one more little piece on the on this question of conflicts that I wanted to touch on, and that was because we phrased the question again a little differently for certain focus groups, and there are a dozen summary points, themes that came up in those groups, which I'm going to reduce into 4 basic groupings. One was a concern about keeping artists and art spaces and art venues affordable and accessible, and arts education in the schools as an essential part of public education. That transportation, again, came up as a major concern, especially accessible public transportation. And accessibility really goes not only to public transit, but also buildings and streets in Northampton, sidewalks and all. Affordability, whether we're talking about affordable housing or jobs that can support living in Northampton, and additional businesses. And then sort of a diverse grouping here of recreation, open space, and educational issues. Concern about preserving more green spaces and open lands, providing more recreational areas and activities that are safe and affordable, especially for youth, and preserving this environment of tolerance and diversity, particularly within the schools, and supporting the schools. Are there additional factoids you want to put together?
Can I just ask, we do a little survey. How many of you drove here tonight? Okay. So, you know, one of the discussions is we get interesting conflicts in all this. And so parking downtown is a little factoid I want to talk about, but it's one of those that people feel passionately about, even though I think almost everybody in every forum thought it was really important to have a healthy downtown. Most people at the forums thought downtown was one of the strengths that we have. We really want to preserve it, and different ways to do it, but downtown is really important. And it's really important to get people who go downtown to walk around downtown. Within that, we had some real big disagreements about parking. At every single focus group, one of the things we heard most often was downtown's horrible, I can't park. And the data set bears that out. We have on-street parking utilization of between 88 and 95%. Typically people talk about 85% being a healthy rate, so people aren't driving around all the time. We have off-street parking utilization at 85%, which is incredibly high in the peak hours, incredibly high for off-street parking. And so there's an argument saying if we really want downtown to be successful, we need to have more parking spaces downtown. It's important for people who drive downtown, whether it's people from out of town or people in Northampton, drive downtown and park and then walk around. And the downtown's competition is King Street and the mall in Hadley and the mall in Holyoke, and that's where people drive otherwise. So it's important to have parking. And then we get other people who say, well, but you know, parking induces trips. If we have parking, then people who would otherwise walk and bicycle are going to drive and have the parking. So the reason my little survey is sort of the same concept. Tonight's a beautiful night, a lot of people could bicycle, but the reality is most of you probably have good reasons why majority of you drove here. Most of you probably have good reasons why you drove here. You live some distance away, you're worried about it at night, you have to rush home to a child, there's lots of reasons to do it. So there's this real conflict between our vision of a city where everybody walks everywhere, bicycles everywhere, and the reality of all of our lives.
Do you know what percentage of parking spaces downtown during the day or evening are taken up by outsiders versus us locals who drive everywhere?
Not directly. We certainly have figures. Terry's talked about some of those of sort of what of our businesses are coming from outside the, outside the city and from outside the region, and presumably all those people are driving. So we have some indirect measures, but not very. Was there anything else with the parking study?
No, not for that. Although it might be an interesting survey if we could get the parking staff to measure the garage someday and just look at license plates. Or inventory people, or if you have a Massachusetts plate, where you're from.
I was just thinking that, in terms of us behaving better, I'm one of those people that thinks that controversial thing, the parking downtown should be free, because I hear so many people complaining about it. And, if we build more parking and it's people from out of town who are coming to the economy, that's one thing. If it's us getting lazier and lazier, one of the things is that people come out of town, they drive, and they can only find one parking space, so they're not driving from one place to another in Northampton. So they're not contributing to downtown traffic as much as we are.
And one of the issues people always look at is, in large, people often are comparing, you see this in the AIA study. One of the recommendations in the AIA study was we should have satellite parking lots and people should be shuttled in downtown. And it's a large, frankly, it's a large city recommendation. It works in big cities where, you go to San Francisco and you park and you take, the Muni downtown or whatever it is. But, in Northampton, where there's free parking 2 blocks from the parking garage, it seems unlikely that people are going to park in a parking lot 10 blocks and take a shuttle. And so part of the debate I think the community has to have is how much are we trying to encourage people's behavior by making the wrong behavior unattractive, difficult to park downtown? And how much we're trying to encourage behavior by making the right behavior more attractive. Park and ride lots and better bike paths and those kinds of things. There's no right answer. We have to look at all those things.
Are there any businesses or institutions that are implementing a parking cash out program?
I don't know if John wants to comment. Smith is doing a comprehensive plan right now for parking, and they're looking at every option that's out there. I don't know where they're going to go for that. But no, other than that, as far as I know, no one is doing it.
I think that could pretty dramatically reduce, for people who don't know that concept, real estate, parking lots are real estate, and money goes towards that spot that each car goes in, and employees can be paid that amount of cash. I can't explain this very well. Maybe there are others who know better.
Go ahead. Well, essentially it's paying employees not to bring their car into town and to pay them an amount that reflects the true cost of parking. And the reality is that parking spaces cost us money because they're using real estate that could be used for other uses. And places that have a system that compensates people for not essentially cashing out the subsidy. When people park for free and their employer provides the parking, Smith is a good example, it's like giving them a subsidy in their salary. And when you try to get them to pay for it, it never works because they rebel. But you can turn it around and say people who don't drive to work can be paid for not doing that. That's because they're saving the college money that would otherwise be spent for parking. And similar principle, it's a little more complicated to do it in a city.
But, we've done sort of a mini survey in my department just to get a sense of this, which is, I have a secretary who I'm happy to pick on, who lives half a mile from my office, and I suspect she has never walked to work in 22 years working for the city. And she in some ways would be the target population. How do we shift that behavior? I have someone in my office who comes from about 15 miles away or 20 miles away, and on a beautiful Saturday, beautiful weekdays, he actually does bicycle already. He's probably not so much our target. He doesn't live near a bus line. So it's one of those things on the margins. How do you get people who, I live a mile from downtown and I'd like to shift my behavior. So how do we get those kinds of people to shift? And obviously, some people will shift more easily in good weather, and only some relatively hardcore people will shift in bad weather. The other part of this, of course, and this goes back to Terry's figure, I think the first one she talked about, is the number of people who can walk downtown. Part of this is, it's not only what do you do for the transportation system, but what do you do for the land use system. The reason Terry talked about 25% of the population within half a mile is a magical number. If you're half a mile away, most people will go on foot. Not elderly, not disabled, but most people will go on foot. If you're a mile away, some people will go on foot. If you're further away than that, relatively few people will go on foot. And so those numbers become magic numbers and what an opportunity for sure.
There's one other planning challenge, and I'm aware of time, but I want to say this because we've talked about affordable housing, we've talked about city resources. The center of our town is also the most expensive part of our town. So less and less people who work at Smith or work for city government can afford to live there. So less and less of those people can afford to easily walk to work. So we're seeing a larger number of people who don't even live in the city working for the city. And there's no bus routes to where they live. So the cash out idea only works if there's good alternatives. And we've got to think through that. So I just want, this didn't come up earlier, Molly, and I really want to say this. There are things we can do in our comprehensive plan to talk about sustainability, but our borders are permeable, and we have, so that regional hub piece that Molly talked about is really critical. We can't solve all these problems by ourselves. So the cash out piece really comes in the next section too. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that are coming into part 4 here that Molly's going to do, lots of good suggestions that people had. But some of them have to be embedded in that regional context. How do we do this as a region? In the absence of regional government, something that came up last night. Massachusetts has no good way of talking as a region.
Just quickly, a quick comment and question. I think that you guys have done a great job of looking at some of these conflicts, because I think when you are trying to deal with environmental or ecological sustainability, you need to look at some of this other stuff as well. I mean, there are disparities between people's values and people's wants and people's actual behaviors, and I think that you're setting yourself up to be much more realistic and deliberate in the planning process by factoring this stuff in. So I'm really impressed by how much you've looked at some of this stuff. And then just quickly, is there any chance that the parking thing is a little bit of a cultural myth in Northampton? Because I've never had a problem getting a parking spot. I mean, is this about everybody wants door-side parking immediately in front of where they're going? Or is it a perception of traffic congestion? Because I've never not been able to find a spot in the garage. I've never been able to not find a spot in the municipal lot. It's not an issue. And so why is it that there's kind of this whole thing of parking in Northampton is so awful when it's really 1 block away from downtown? What's that all about?
That's a really good question.
We don't have as much data.
I don't live here, can you tell?
We don't have as much data as I'd like. But let me answer just break that quickly into 3 categories. One is people who are coming downtown to spend $100 on dinner a night, or go to the Calvin Theater, or go to the Academy. I think you're right. There's no parking shortage there. You decide you want to come downtown, you can find a spot downtown. Likewise, I think the city's begun to address the issue of if you're coming down to do your dry cleaning because there's 15-minute parking spots in town. But the story that I'll tell is a little different. I've begun to start collecting stories of, let's ignore what people should do, what behaviors there are, and what we all want them to do. Let's talk about what people are doing, which is, I've been here 17 years. When I got here 17 years ago, the majority, maybe a bare majority, of upper floor off Main Street was commercial. Now there's no question the vast majority of upper floor is residential. And a lot of that commercial is people who want to have parking lots, and they're moving to the fringes of downtown. You may have heard a debate going on before the planning board about should a publishing firm be allowed in Dewey Court. You see a lot of development on State Street right now. You see Hadley Crossing and Hadley, which a lot of those businesses used to be in downtown Northampton. So, we can collect the stories on the number of properties that we're losing businesses downtown. The one I'm focusing on right now is the old bookbinder next to the old fire station, where that property's been on the market for a long time. And the reality is, yeah, lots of parking. People can go to the parking garage. But they have lost a lot of buyers because there's no parking there. So from my standpoint, whether people should act differently or not, they don't, and the result is we're forcing them into much more suburban locations like
So there's no parking because people won't park where there's parking?
Well, people want,
Yeah.
The typical figure is people want to park within 500 feet of where they're going. And there's not a lot of parking within 500 feet of where they're going. In big cities, obviously, people go further distances. Right?
One thing that went on the parking statistics, the parking study showed that there was actually a deficit on the north side of Main Street. On the south side of Main Street, there's no deficit at all, it's fine. So we were looking at a way to try to prevent people from circulating around, to actually try to redistribute and have additional public parking more on the north side to supplement the lack of it there, and, you know, the south side's parking.
You haven't had a chance to speak. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that when we talk about parking, it's somewhat implied that, or at least it sounds like it is, that we're just going to build more parking spots, and that's maybe the next step in the plan is that that's a very important thing to discuss, and all the other options on the table before we get to that extremely expensive option of building more spots. That there's just wonderful things that are out there that other communities are trying. I for one, on the planning board, and would hope that we look at all those things. So.
You're on the planning board, so we will, because you never voted.
Yeah. Could I mention one thing about that? Because I think if you look at parking, you shouldn't look at it just as parking per se, but if you want to look at the sustainability piece of parking, you can look at how it relates to a project or a retail or an event piece. Now, if the Hotel Northampton wanted a convention center at the hotel and they built a parking garage to support that convention center, I think that would be great for the city. That would be a sustainable use, and the parking would be absolutely necessary. So you can't divorce the parking from the intended uses and the consequences. And we've seen that with the Calvin when it was redeveloped. It was wonderful, but they have a large theater with no parking. And so when there's an event there, then the north side of Main Street is, people are circulating trying to find a parking space and missing half of the concert. So it's a real issue, but it's tied to other things rather than just a place to put your car. It could be tied to other things.
These comments are great, and I'm also aware of the time. Garrett, you want to make a quick comment?
Just quickly, you know, if you know where the parking spots are, you can find them. If you're coming from Hartford or Boston, you don't know. And a lot of it is not whether you can find a parking space, it's whether you get a ticket. And you know, I understand that it's a source of revenue for the city. I think this is a big sustainability question is, can we find some other way to get that revenue for the city so that visitors to this town don't get pissed off and never come back? And I've heard, you know, 3 or 4 people say that. And that's serious.
I just want to reinforce what the last 3 people have said. I commute in town in a lot of different ways. I walk into town at least twice from the Bay State area, just so I don't have to drive back because I have a margarita coming in, margarita leaving. And it works for me. I probably eat in more commercial places in town than anybody else in town, except those that do it every single night. I drive an awful lot. I'm probably not typical maybe of the people in this room. I will continue to drive a lot because I want to get to my places quickly, and I want it to be convenient. I want to access my way through town as rapidly as possible, so I want a pretty good monitored traffic flow system. Okay. I never have a problem parking in town for exactly the same reason. On the north side, I can find 15, 16 parking spaces to go to a concert on the north side, to go to any of the establishments that you've talked about. The solution, I think, is not to build more parking spaces. In the parking garage, I've never seen it more than 50% filled when I am there. And I'm there at all different times, except for those really high-density occurrences. It's advertising where those parking spaces are, being more friendly to those people outside. I'd be more than supportive to find alternative ways to fund the budget rather than metered parking. And I make a good income. I'm more than willing to continue to support that, but it doesn't make sense for people outside the town. And to me, that's the vibrancy which continues to support Northampton, is those people coming from outside.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to the 4th question, which had to do with very specific suggestions that people had for the city. What would you have the city do to, you know, what kind of actions should they take, or policies should they implement, or infrastructure improvements would you recommend to try and get us toward a more sustainable Northampton? And again, the categories are the same as the areas of conflict, not surprisingly. And just going through them rapidly, again, I won't touch on every single thing, but in terms of transportation, people had a lot of suggestions for implementing traffic calming measures, carpooling, sharing, ride lots, addressing pedestrian safety with more accessible sidewalks, better crosswalks, pedestrian-only zones, increasing public transit and more bike lanes and bike racks, in addition to additional parking where and if needed. In terms of equity issues, addressing affordable housing options, not just subsidized, but we're really talking about middle-income housing, that people who live and who work in Northampton can afford housing, both rental and purchase. Affordable, safe recreation areas and activities, public education issues, such as making sure that we can address students whose first language is not English, that they're not losing in terms of the achievement standards in the school, addressing younger grades, embracing diversity and greater sense of community, including greater accessibility and community policing, and continuing to embrace all of the residents of Northampton, old timers and newcomers. In addition to job training, a lot of these issues, as you said, bridge each other, and this is, could be seen as an economic development or equity issue. It's both. Training, job training, particularly for the youth and the disadvantaged. In terms of land use, recommendations to concentrate development in urban or already dense areas, especially where there's infrastructure that can support that. Encourage mixed use and infill, creating incentive areas or disincentives for certain areas in terms of land use, protecting natural resources, finding a way to balance where we need to build, what we need to build, and what we need to save or protect or make more accessible through greenways or whatever. This includes people who live in these denser areas are saying, don't take away all of our pocket parks and open spaces just because it's a good infill opportunity. People who live in dense neighborhoods need the green space as well. In terms of energy and environment, there are a lot of very specific examples, but to summarize them again, that the city itself take the lead in setting an example for energy conservation and finding alternative sources of energy, developing a climate protection plan, focusing on renewable energy sources, establishing building standards that focus on green building, and that has to do not only with management of sites, but what materials you use and how well insulated, and the kind of Energy Star standards that buildings have. And reestablishing, reactivating the Northampton Energy Resource Commission. Cultural and economic issues include supporting the arts, artists, art education has come up over and over again, and not just in the focus group that was at the Center for the Arts. Creating affordable live, work, studio space for artists, but also for others in the community. Incentives and programs for startup businesses, whether these be minority businesses or green businesses or the arts, but we really want to be able to establish new creative incubator type businesses. Increasing business and job opportunities and training, redeveloping Hospital Hill, Fairgrounds, King Street, however that takes place, that needs to be a focus as well, and improving telecommunications. And at the heart of this, as the mayor has said, there has to be, Northampton has to take the lead in terms of regional collaboration and really making sure that we're talking with other communities, not just in terms of transportation, but in terms of housing and jobs and land use, open space protection, wildlife corridors, all of those things that don't know political boundaries. So that's the brief summary of a lot of very concrete and creative suggestions that came out of these forums that would help us get to establishing these kinds of values in the comprehensive plan. So, other comments? Yes?
One of the things I'd like to suggest is that the planning department make an effort to address the entrances to the city. There's some areas there that may have outlived their usefulness in either idle land or buildings, a little seedy. if we could make an effort to make those areas attractive, not, I don't mean big signs, welcome to Northampton, but I mean, with landscaping and an entrance, almost a mini park type thing as an entrance, I think would really make our city quite attractive. I think it can be easily done, but it takes planning. You can't do it in 1 year. You have to plan and have a set arrangement. And when the opportunity comes, the city should move on it and say, this is our entrance area here, and we're going to dress it up.
Great point. As working for a landscape architecture office, we always like to hear recommendations like that. Other comments? People hang up. I know that we want to address what the city's going to do with all of this, and that's what Wayne's going to wrap up the meeting with. The Patriots and this is it.
I'll try to be brief here, but energy needs to be embedded into each of these areas. It should not be seen exclusively as a separate area. In terms of equity and affordable housing, for example, how will those units be heated? With natural gas and petroleum that are both bottoming out? We need to think about that, or else we will have these relics in no short time. In terms of economic and cultural, energy needs to be in there, considering this tourism. Will people continue to have disposable income in a future of depleted energy, which our economy is based on? Will they continue to travel to get here to spend the disposable income?
In the previous graphic, I had the arrows that were interrelating all of the different bubbles, and I think that the same thing could be said for a lot of these issues,
Yes.
that they're so interwoven that we really need to address all of them with a consciousness of the other topical areas. It's just a way of dividing it for clarity, but I think your point is well taken.
And food, I think we need to think seriously, as this woman was suggesting about agriculture and the future of food. In terms of the embodied energy in food, it takes 10 units of energy to create 1 unit of food. And that's in fertilizers, petroleum, transportation, packaging. I don't see that as we look at Northampton's future. I don't see us looking at these really kind of nitty-gritty issues that are maybe a little bit uncomfortable, but that we need to look at. The future of energy is not kind of more of the status quo of what we've known. It's changing pretty dramatically, and we need to consider.
Yes.
Just a thought, I like the nice emphasis on affordable housing and perhaps a little more emphasis on affordable commercial space. And I don't have any great solutions for it, but clearly for me, the square footage cost downtown and the turnover of businesses, it's an anomaly.
The number of empty spaces.
Yeah, and I don't know if there could be some programming for besides the incubator aspect, which is great, but for those standing establishments that need to maintain themselves there and not turn into more restaurants, even though I love restaurants. Yeah, there are other things in life that produce...
Ditto for office space, too.
Yeah.
Not actually office space. And why?
Tell us where we're headed with all of this.
I said there are half a dozen people here who on the Sustainable Nutrition Steering Committee. Just here to stand up briefly so I can see you all. So thank you very much for that. So you know where the step is going, where the process is going. Both sort of Paige's comment and Joel's comment about sustainability and energy are an important part of this. The planning board is involved in this process. The Sustainable Northampton Steering Committee who just stood up and the mayor who first initiated this process have all sort of said they're committed to sustainability as being part of the theme as we go forward for this. And so, I mean, I think that's going to show up as we go through the process. That said, this goes back to my quick survey of who drove here. This has to be a plan that's grounded in reality. It has to be, I mean, the reality of Paige's comments notwithstanding is, for the next generation, the majority of food in Northampton is going to be imported. And I don't want to be involved with a plan that has goals that we can't really achieve. So the community participation, the community feelings about this are really a critical part of where we're going. In the first page of the data, we just summarized what the next steps are, just in terms of where the plan is coming from. So we started actually, the survey was mailed to all of you, and so that the data is in here. That's going to help influence the final plan. The 9 focus groups, the extra meetings that we're doing in the fall. Obviously, we're looking at state mandates, so we don't spend a lot of time writing plans and zoning that aren't legal. Looking at state incentives, so we look at those things. Looking, actually, I got to put this on the list, but going back to the AIA SSTAT recommendations from the October and November meeting, looking at their recommendations. So that's sort of the background. We're also going to look at all the plans that are on the books now. We're not trying to start this over again. This would be too daunting a process for starting fresh. We'll be doing everything from looking back at Vision 2020, which is the city's last big plan from 8 years ago, up to the open space and recreation plan and the transportation plan, which was adopted just 6 months ago or 8 months ago, and bringing those things into this document. And then we're going to be working with all the boards who ultimately have to make this plan work. So legally, the planning board has to adopt a plan. We've always committed to both the Sustainable Northampton Steering Committee and City Council to approve the plan. But likewise, if the Transportation and Parking Commission doesn't like the recommendations, or if Board of Public Works doesn't like the recommendations, the plan is not going to be that effective. So we need to sort of go on the road and build all those groups and get involved in the process. So the plan is the steering committee and staff and all those different boards I talked about are going to be working on the plan over the next few months. Hopefully in September, maybe in October, we come back and we say, here's the goals that we think have emerged. I mean, we have the first step of here's the goals that seem to come from the public process. And so those sort of set the agenda. We'll be looking at those and adding some new goals, then maybe some of these goals that don't survive the process. Our commitment isn't to copy over everything we've heard from the public. Our commitment is to have the public session set the agenda. So things the public said will either show up in the plan or the plan with documentation saying, this doesn't make sense for this reason. So people can see, it's a transparent process. People can see what's out there. So September, October, we come back with goals and objectives, and we try to figure out, are we in the right direction? And then what we want to do with this plan that makes it a little different from what some communities do is be of a more implementation-focused plan. Rather than sort of completing a plan and starting over on how we implement it, I think we want to be pretty clear that there's been lots of energy, incredible number of suggestions. We want the plan to be sort of rich enough that people really see where it's going. So I'm not exactly sure what that means, but it may include draft zoning, it may include draft, public investment strategies, all those sort of things we want to look at. And we don't know where those are going yet, but that's the direction.
Final comments. Joel.
Well, so I heartily endorse getting started implementation as part of the process. I don't want to sound like I'm repeating myself, but I think there's a concern about, I fully endorse being practical, but I think there's a danger in relying on survey and trend data as your test of what's practical. Because it seems to me part of the purpose of this is that we're not trend planning, we're vision planning. And therefore, it's not easy, and it's very tricky. How do you decide how visionary to be? And I would suggest that you have to be more visionary than a survey would lead you to think you should be, but not so visionary that you can't accomplish it. And I guess that's the edge that I think we're working on, and we need to get there.
I would agree with that, Joel. And in fact, I think this next phase of the steering committee's work, we have to work really hard to be sure that we incorporate all this survey work and understand public opinion. And I do think it's been fed back and synthesized quite well in the process. And understand all the data that's available, but recognize that the data is looking in a rearview mirror. We have to understand that. But the third piece of it, I think, where the vision piece comes in, is going back to the AIA work, encouraging perspectives, case studies from other communities that have been grappling with some of these issues, bring those in. I think that that's one area where the sustainability piece is going to be there is to really welcome ideas that, and expertise that come in from outside. And I think that's where we really got to integrate those three things: outside expertise and case studies, along with the data and the public opinion.
Yeah, great.
I think Joel's really, and we all are bringing up a values question, and it's a question of what values are we embed in this plan. And I think we've tried to pull some of those values from the community, and so some of this feedback is actually helping to do values clarification. So the job of the steering committee is to say, okay, what are these our goals? What are these are really inherent values? And then what can we take from those values and move forward? And I think the encouraging thing about the survey data and the forums is that a lot of the things that I would say are important for our sustainability came out as values. And so now how do we make those values either policy, ordinance, or whatever? And that's what we need to do next. So I don't think it's missing. I think we're still in the transition period to get there.
Forgive my impatience. I think you're doing a great job.
We need people to push it. And one other thing I want to say, and I may agree with Wayne that we're not going to start growing all of our own food in the next 10 years, but I do think that we are going to have pieces of this that talk about issues such as agriculture, and we've already started talking about agriculture by creating an agriculture commission, for instance. But the other piece of this is not a plan for the rest of creation. Northampton made the big mistake of doing a comprehensive plan 30 years ago and never doing one again. So our goal here is to do a comprehensive plan now and do another comprehensive plan within recent, so that people still remember this process. So, and I think we talked about 10, wasn't it 10 years, Wayne, or
5 years revisiting, 10 years.
Right, 5 years visited again, 10 years do another full plan, which is something we haven't done. So there may be things that people say, boy, what is their problem? They really should be paying attention to this. Some people are just more enlightened, and in 5 years we might say, boy, we really should pay attention to this, and we're going to do it. Or things could have changed. So the other part of this is to build in check-ins, check back, and come back in 5 and then 10 years to say, are we still going in the direction we thought we should have gone in 10 years? Are conditions external to Northampton still leading us in that direction, or other directions, et cetera?
And there's also the distinction between what we establish as goals. What are these long-range visionary goals we really want to achieve? And what are the realistic steps that we need to be taking in the next 5 years or 10 years to make some progress so that we can say we have some success? And it may not be, being petroleum-free. It may not be growing all our own food. But we're making steps, and part of it is the consciousness raising. So, yeah.
So, one quick thing, I think the mayor's point about this revisiting is really important in another way, in that it will allow us to for people to know that it'll be updated, and maybe we can try some things and be a little more experimental than we otherwise would have been if this was for perpetuity. It's a very complicated interaction with everything we do, and some of these may have undesirable effects, and that correcting during the course is a great idea.
I want to laud the efforts, but I do also want to say that I think that the data is flawed because of how it is framed. There are communities that are beginning to draft energy descent action plans. These are communities that are recognizing upfront with their citizens, we're facing a future of depleted energy, and we need to plan with that in mind, and not just build on the paradigm that we know. And I think that the questions asked in the survey reflect the status quo and don't take us very much further into a future that's really uncharted territory. And I would have liked to have seen it framed more centrally, and so that the citizens, as they respond, would have that information to work with.
I'm going to take 2 more comments, and then I'm going to let you all go. Martha?
Yeah, just a couple things. I think, first of all, the data that's here is is not all the data that we have and not all the data that we're using. This is just a selection of the data because, you know, the total data is like hundreds of pages and we didn't want to swamp people with it. There's been lots of information going around on that Sustainable Northampton website and elsewhere about energy policies that other communities have taken, you know, are trying, and we are reading those things too, and we will be taking those into account. So this is not, you know, this one chart on energy is not the only thing that there is, and I think that's important. And the other thing I think is energy does appear everywhere, and many people are aware that it is not the primary concern for everybody in the community. It is the primary concern for some people. Affordable housing is the primary concern for some people. Parking is the prime, you know, all these things are related. We need to take all these things into account. And it may not, the plan that comes out with all the best effort may not look exactly like you would like it to look. And it probably won't look exactly like anybody would like it to look, but we're going to do our best to try to take all these different things into account. And the other thing I wanted to just say is just kind of to remind us of something that Molly pointed out before, and I'm always reminding my students of this when I teach urban politics. Northampton does not exist in a vacuum. And as the mayor pointed out, there's only so much we can do for ourselves. You know, there are people going to be, unless we want to put up barriers around the town, people are going to be driving into town, whether we like them to or not, and most of us, I think, want them to because we want their money at the very least, right? You know, but all these things, and so the drains on our resources and the impact on our environment are not things that we can control completely. We can have an impact on them, but we can't control them. And so, you know, there are a lot of things that we are needing to be taken into account, and we're going to do the best that we can. But, you know, I think the one thing I can promise you is it's not going to be a perfect plan. It's going to be as close to good as we can get, but it's not going to be perfect.
Last comment.
I confess I have a really hard time articulating my thoughts because it's so close to my heart. But I really cannot understand how the city can run this campaign, sustainability campaign, and touch on all these issues and explore them all, and yet at the very same time develop, cultivate, and push forward another agenda that's quite contrary to many of these values, that being the development of Smith College, and how that impinges on many of these goals and values. As for revisiting plans, there was a master plan maybe 30-something years ago, but there have been subsequent plans. 11 years ago, 95, the issues were still quite relevant and pertinent to today. That they're not being revisited or reconsidered or used is another matter, but we haven't been living in a vacuum for 30 years. There have been many plans, comprehensive plans done subsequent to the comprehensive one that just may not be pulled out and dusted off and reconsidered or revisited.
I think as Wayne said, the intention is to bring all of those goals and those plans together in the crafting of this. Thank you. And you all have been great. This has been a great discussion. Thank you for coming, and keep tuned. Log on to the website, find out what's happening with it, and keep your eye open for the meeting in the fall when the city will be back with the first draft or first aspects of the draft. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, Mother.
I don't in fact believe